I think we are live. So, on behalf of Beacon House School System, the organizer of School of Tomorrow events, I'd like to welcome you to a world of tomorrow from darkness to light. The 12th edition of SOT events, and the second one that is virtual. The non-profit SOT event series was launched by Beacon House in 2000 to help inform the direction of the organization while also engaging global communities in conversations shaping the future of schools and society. My name is Munizae Jahanger, and I'm moderating this session on behalf of Beacon House School System. I'm a television journalist and editor of voicepk.net, which is Pakistan's first digital media platform focusing on human rights issues. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this live session, The New US Leadership and a Balanced Future for the World. Now, the nail-biting US elections, as you all know, has given birth to a renewed hope for equality and a period of healing in the US and across the world, especially sitting here from Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in a recent speech in New York, Mr. Biden said that foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. They're deeply connected. He also talked about democracy and said how that is important to him and to his party. So all eyes are now turned towards the new president-elect to make global adjustments that address diplomatic, environmental, public health, economic, and other key considerations. This session brings together a former Foreign Minister of Pakistan, a former British diplomat and Assistant Private Secretary to Her Majesty the Queen in England, and the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much for all of you for joining us. Now I will give a detailed introduction to all of the panelists today. I'll begin with Sir Tim Hitchens, who's the President of the Wolfson College, Oxford, if I got that right, and Chairman of the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, a Commonwealth War Graves Commissioner. He was a British diplomat from 1983 to 2018. He was the head of the political team at the British High Commission in Pakistan. And from 1998 to 2002, he was Assistant Private Secretary to Her Majesty the Queen. And he ended his overseas career with the British government as British Ambassador to Tokyo in 2016. Michael Kugelman is joining us from the United States, the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. He's a leading specialist on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, and their relations with the United States. He's the editor and co-editor of 11 books. He has written for the New York Times, the Foreign Policy, and other publications, covering wide-ranging topics from US policy in Afghanistan to terrorism, water, energy, and food security in the region. Last but not least, our very own Mr. Khurshid Kasuri, the former Foreign Minister of Pakistan, as well as a former caretaker Minister for Parliamentary Affairs. He began his political career with the Tehreek-e-Istiqlal, where he rose to be its General Secretary. Mr. Kasuri was elected to the National Assembly in 1997, and from 2002 to 2007, he served as a foreign minister in which he proactively engaged the international community in attempts to meet the challenges posed by the crisis in Afghanistan, especially with the United States. He was a senior advisor on political and international affairs and chairman of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, now in power, their task force on Kashmir, and a member of the core committee of the party. He's also the author of the book, Neither a Hawk Nor a Dove. So the audience that is now joining us online, they can ask questions at any time. And they can send us their questions. We will set out and keep 10 to 12 minutes for the question and answer session. I'm sure you're all sick of my voice, so I'll throw the first question to Michael, who's sitting in the United States, because we're asking about his president after all. And the first question posed to you, Michael, is by the Beacon system, which is that President Trump has been demonized globally so many times before. But the truth really is that he is the only US president in the past 30 years not to declare war on other countries. So can the world now expect to go back to open aggression of the past? And what kind of a president will he be, the new president-elect, for the rest of the world?
Well, thank you very much, Munizae, and thank you to Beacon House, first of all, just for inviting me to participate in this very timely discussion, and especially with such a distinguished panel of Minister Kasuri and Ambassador Hitchens, along with you, of course, one of Pakistan's great journalists. I think just want to say very briefly that it is very hard to overestimate what a pivotal moment the US and the world are facing at this moment as we await the inauguration of President-elect Biden. And he's going to be taking office as one of the most foreign policy savvy US presidents in recent memory. Certainly since George H.W. Bush, who had previously served as vice president and CIA director. So Biden really knows the world well. That's important to keep in mind. But keep in mind as well that Biden's going to be taking office at a moment when the US is arguably facing its greatest period of domestic crisis, maybe since the late 1960s. You've got essentially a three simultaneous generational crises: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a social crisis. So I think at least initially, the focus for this incoming administration will be domestic, not overseas. But to get to your question, I would argue that Biden, or the President-elect Biden, is not interested in this notion of open aggression. He is not interested in military adventurism. And also many of the conditions that one could argue provoked the Obama administration, for example, to carry out military strikes and military actions are no longer in place. So, for example, the drone war that he inherited from the Bush administration and intensified, that's pretty much over. Even during the Trump administration, it really winded down. And that's because the key targets have really all been taken out. Biden is not about to send more troops to Afghanistan, I don't think, or to the Middle East. There's really no desire for new surges. And really the Middle East, which is one of the key places where the US has launched or participated in conflicts in recent years, I think that region will retain less strategic interest or value for Biden than previously. And one reason for that is that the US energy interests there are not really as sharp as they had been previously. And to conclude, I think that the one place to watch, to get at your question, the one place to watch is Asia and the US rivalry with China. Certainly, I think that Beijing's actions in the South China Sea have caused problems for US treaty allies and hence for US interests. Biden does want to take a softer approach to the relationship with China. He'll still look at it as a threat, but not with the level of hostility as President Trump has. And Biden has spoken of looking for cooperation where it exists, and this could lower temperatures. So I see Asia as the potential flashpoint for US-China rivalry, but in terms of potential for conflict, things like that, I would not overstate that. I like to think that this incoming president will not look at the world in that way.
All right, well, thank you very much. Sir Hitchens, I'll come to you. Of course, former President Trump did not really have a very good relationship with the Mayor of London, and we saw that play out in public almost. But is this going to be now a new era of reconciliation of some sorts with President-elect Biden coming in? And how do you see President-elect Biden interacting with, let's say, with Great Britain, also with the European Union and with Brexit around the corner?
I mean, of course, President Trump is still President Trump until January. Yes. I think your original question suggesting that we're moving from an era President Trump, who is not an interventionist, to an era perhaps of aggression. It's difficult either in Europe or in the States to recognize that description of Joe Biden. There is an ironic truth behind it, which is that Trump, for all his great bluster, is someone who hasn't, as you say, started wars, hasn't been as interested in actions overseas that might attract criticism. And the areas where he's been most difficult, most challenging for the allies is in the areas of alliance, which would normally be expected to be a given in American foreign policy. So, ever since the end of the Second World War, it's a given that the United States wants to preserve the international institutions, that it wants to build alliances, that it wants to advance democracy, wants to advance a liberal order. And I think what has baffled and worried and confused many Europeans is his willingness, his ability to undermine things that we took for granted. So I think that there is a great heave of sigh of relief in Europe that we have a Joe Biden. But I think, as Michael says, we're not going back to where we were 4 years ago or even 12 years ago, because the world has significantly changed in that period, and it's changed in the sense of the balance of power is much more evenly distributed. And though the world wants Joe Biden as a new president to come back and be more engaged in the world, more supportive of international structures, work more closely with allies, I think the idea of American leadership is one that is more contested. And I'm interested in the way in which in the US, people at the moment, the commentators will often describe both a return to the rules-based order and American leadership as effectively the same thing, whereas in fact, the world has moved on and American leadership will look and feel very different now to what it would look and have felt like 8 years ago or 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kasuri Saab, one thing that Michael also talked about was the engagement of the United States and the re-engagement of the United States with America, for example, with China, for example. And how would you see it? Do you feel like there's a perception here in Pakistan that in fact it will be the engagement with China that would then set the policy for South Asia? Do you feel that way, that would then, everything would stem from the engagement with China? That would be the first thing, and then everything else will come later regarding the engagement in India, Afghanistan, Pakistan?
I think that would be an oversimplification. First of all, I do not believe that what we are hearing nowadays, that there was a consensus vis-a-vis China in the United States. There wasn't even a consensus in the Republican Party. I'm just reading this book by Bolton, The Room Where It Happened. And he talks of differences within the Republican Party. And there's a special love for Secretary of Treasury, I think Mnuchin, if that's how it's pronounced, and calls him a panda hugger. In other words, he didn't think that there was a complete unanimity inside the Republican Party. And as far as Democrats are concerned, there may well be more panda huggers in the Democratic Party than there were in the Republican Party. Now, I understand the nature of differences between the United States and China, but I feel it will be terrible for the world. And I think almost half a decade ago, The Economist wrote a leader, and it warned the world that, we've seen this miraculous cooperation between China and the United States, which has been good for the world. Let's not fall into what the editorial, or rather the book, called the Thucydides trap, and referred to ancient rivalry between Athens and Sparta, and then more recently in our times, when the world couldn't tolerate the rise of Germany. And saw the consequences of the case of the Second World War. My hope is that this will be contained, otherwise we may be sleepwalking into World War III, and I hope that doesn't happen. And therefore, my own impression is that President Biden, being the experienced person, and I dealt with him when I was Foreign Minister, and is a ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, and I know him well. Of course, he's dealt with many Pakistani leaders, and I do not think that he's going to sleepwalk the world into a third world war. And therefore, my impression is also because there are other problems in the United States. The economy currently, he cannot just afford to follow that sort of possibility. The only country that's now going to, let's say, become engine to growth is the only China, which is now expanding at almost 5%. Other countries are either minus 30, minus 20, minus 10, minus 5, minus 4, or whatever, with European Union, North America, or Asia. Look at India, which was minus 30. Now it's minus 10 or 11, or whatever it is in the last quarter. Therefore, China, as an engine of growth, I think President Biden doesn't have the flexibility at a time when America is badly hit by the coronavirus crisis. He will try and cool temperatures. I do admit that there will be a rivalry between the two, competition, and I think the old warmth that we had seen is probably a matter of history, is past. But President-elect Biden is experienced enough to know that China has been dealt with in a different way. And
all right. Right. But another question that comes to mind is that one of the things that is being, I mean, there is some speculation in Afghanistan, for example, that with new President-elect Biden, there may be a delay in pulling out of troops from Afghanistan. Do you feel that way? Do you think that could happen?
I hope he'll be less reckless, but I think as far as pulling out is concerned, he's already on record that he wishes to pull out of Afghanistan. The speed may differ. President Trump has meant very little to him because he'll change the ground reality. We've all heard recently about pullout from Iraq and from Afghanistan. From Afghanistan, a major withdrawal to 4,500. It will now come down to 2,500. So with that sort of resources on the ground, I think President-elect Biden will have many difficulties. I don't think he wants to really carry on this war, but he would definitely want a more orderly withdrawal. He would like the Afghan national government to be involved in a more meaningful way with the Taliban. I expect Pakistan to play that role, and I hope Pakistan will play that role.
All right. Well, we just recently saw Prime Minister Imran Khan go to Kabul and meet President Ashraf Ghani. Michael, you have been studying this part of the world for a very, very long time. Do you agree with Mr. Kasuri that perhaps there will be a delayed response or a delayed pullout of troops or a more calculated one when it comes to President-elect Biden?
Well, this is certainly a big question, because when Biden does turn to foreign policy, I do think that the Afghanistan issue will be one of his top priorities. So, I would argue, on the one hand, we know that Biden is not a fan of staying in Afghanistan. We know that he, like Trump, wants to get out. When Biden was vice president, he was one of the few vocal opponents of his boss's troop surge into Afghanistan. Biden never supported the idea of sending tens of thousands of US troops in Afghanistan. He had always supported the idea of maintaining a small counterterrorism focused presence in Afghanistan. I'm not sure if that view has changed to this day. So he will want to get out. But the thing is that when he takes office, there will only be 2,500 US troops in Afghanistan. So essentially, Trump essentially will have given Biden a fait accompli, where Biden won't need to think about how many more troops to withdraw because there'll be so few left. And perhaps for Biden, the 2,500 that remain will be deemed sufficient for his counterterrorism force ideas. But I do agree that Biden may want to be more strict with the Taliban. I imagine that Biden may threaten to slow down or even halt the withdrawal of the remaining 2,500 troops until there are clear indications that the Taliban is reducing violence and that it is stopping cooperating with al-Qaeda, which are both conditions in these negotiations and agreement that emerged between the US and the Taliban. I don't think that the Trump administration has been as fixated on that. Keeping in mind as well Biden's focus on counterterrorism, I think that for him it'll be very concerning if the Taliban continues to partner with al-Qaeda. But at the end of the day, I don't think that Biden will necessarily have that much patience because he does want to get out. And the question will remain, how does he maintain a counterterrorism capacity in Afghanistan? Would it entail using those 2,500 remaining troops? Well, the Taliban wants all American troops to be out of the country by the spring, by April, May, when the US Taliban agreement stipulates that they all be gone. So he'll have some very tough decisions to make. But my bottom line is, yes, he may be willing to slow down the withdrawal of the remaining troops, but only to a limit. I think that he, at the end of the day, will want to conclude withdrawal as well. It's what he's always believed, and I imagine it's still what he believes now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sir Hitchens, let's talk about the Paris Agreement a little bit. And this is one of the questions that the Beacon House school system wants me to ask, is that will President-elect Biden succeed in rejoining the Paris Agreement and ending the Muslim ban on day one, because that is what he had promised? And will these be just merely symbolic moves? How do you see it?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, my assumption, given what he has said, is that he will want to rejoin Paris. And certainly, I mean, I obviously can't speak for the British government now that I'm retired from it, but I know that the British government is hosting COP26 in Glasgow next November. And for the British authorities, the next 12 months will been very, very focused on reviving Paris and taking significant moves forward on climate change. Now, we know in the preparation for Biden's run for presidency, he was proposing some really quite reaching climate change mitigation measures, shifts in the way the US economy operated. And there was some debate within the Democratic Party as to whether he would really be able to deliver that as significant a change as he was talking about. But from a climate change perspective, I think we would be delighted as Europeans to see a Biden administration making a decisive shift both on Paris and on use of carbon-based resources. And we do feel that there are opportunities, given the commitments and leadership that China has shown, to have a real pole of collaboration and maybe competition in terms of climate change mitigation between the US and China. And as Michael and Mr. Kasuri were saying, we know that that competition between China and the US is going to be the dominant international fact for the next few decades. There will be at which there is great tension between the two, including in the South China Sea. So it'd be really important to find agenda items like climate change where they can show joint leadership, and that will mitigate a little bit some of the natural tensions that will flow from the trying to avoid the Thucydides trap, as Mr. Kasuri put it.
Well, that brings me really to the next question, Mr. Kasuri, and it is that when the new leadership, the new US leadership, saved the US economy and addressed the previous administration's concerns about the rise of China, while somewhat maintaining the global harmony.
Sorry, can you repeat? I can't hear you clearly.
Well, one of the questions being asked here is, will the US leadership try and salvage the US economy and address the previous administration's concerns about the rise of China? Also in the same manner or in the same way, kind of maintaining global harmony?
From what I understand, I mean, there was a disturbance when I was hearing that what will he do to, as far as this economy is concerned? Well,
yes.
I'll respond, but I'm also interested as a former foreign minister of Pakistan, citizen of Asia, what he does for developing countries, because that's how America has in the past maintained its leadership through soft power. What he will do locally, we have a rough idea. He has, in fact, I think the figure is astronomical. He's from a 7 trillion plan in which I think 2 billion or 2 trillion or so is for a green economy. Now, and therefore, President Trump did put in a lot of money. America has the advantage of printing money without really immediate fear of consequences, which other countries can't do. For example, State Bank of Pakistan cannot just continue to print notes. They have luxury within a certain context. So he's going to pump in more money. And I think, but I would be, a citizen of the world, also interested in seeing what he would do towards the developing countries. For example, at the recent G20, although there were a lot of hopes, unfortunately, all they did was delay repayments for 6 months. That is really, I don't want to use a strong word, but it's a very unfortunate decision. Prime Minister of Pakistan and Imran Khan, and I'm sure other leaders must have stressed, for example, they've asked for special drawing rights at the IMF, and also that the credit rating of these countries should not be negatively impacted by a delay in repayment of debts. I think much more is expected from a democratic administration. President Trump made no pretense for either human rights or about third world countries. When he spoke of America first, actually ended up in being America alone. But that's for Americans to judge. But I think, yes, he will take steps to revive the American economy, and I would be interested in what he does to revive world economy after coronavirus pandemic. We're all suffering the consequences, and let's hope that, and for that was also there's need for greater collaboration between China and Pakistan and United States. Now, I continue to emphasize on that we are a country which is particularly interested in improvement of relations between China and Pakistan. We've had old friendships with the United States and with China, and we would not wish that it comes to a zero-sum game. Now, in the past, we played a role. I know that during when Nixon went and through efforts made by Pakistan via Kissinger. But I'm not saying that we can play the same role. But I think President-elect Biden, whereas his obvious choice is going to be India, because they have a strategic relationship with India in trying to counter China. But I think his improvement will relation Pakistan will improve, not only just because of Afghanistan, but I think as has been pointed out by people, there was this book, I think, No Exit from Pakistan, which had listed all the reasons why America, despite the fact finding it difficult, may not find it easy to withdraw from Pakistan, its nuclear program, its population base, the fact that America is keenly interested in India and China, both of which not only neighbor Pakistan, but in which Pakistan plays an important role. Then there are 4 nuclear powers in our region: Pakistan, China, Russia, and India. So this is not an area in which President-elect Biden, at least I hope so, is going to not understand the importance of Pakistan in playing a positive role, particularly with reference to Afghanistan. And I think it's very unfortunate. Americans have tended in recent past to look at Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan. And I hope President Biden, who is a more work through systems, is hopefully going to look at Pakistan in its own right, and not just for Afghanistan. It's in our interest to definitely play a positive role in bringing peace in Afghanistan.
Right. Now, Michael, this is something that Pakistan has been trying to do, to engage the Taliban, and has been quite successful at some level of engaging the Taliban in order to pave the way for peace talks in Afghanistan. Now, with President Biden talking about democracy, about human rights values, as a woman, working in South Asia, I can tell you that my sisters, my journalists in Afghanistan, and human rights activists in Afghanistan are very, very tense about what the future holds. Will there be more of a concern on human rights violations that are bound to happen with the with the Taliban coming back into power or getting some kind of a space in the power sharing agreement? And how would the new president-elect deal with that? Because he knows this area, I think, better than most other, I suppose, contenders before him.
Well, you make a very good point. I mean, it's a very good question that raises some interesting issues. It's true that one key pillar of his foreign policy agenda is strengthening democracy and human rights at home and abroad. And that raises some interesting questions. First of all, it's been quite some time since a US president actually used the democracy promotion idea as a key element of foreign policy. It's certainly not something that Trump did. I would argue that Obama didn't really do it all that much either. I think you have to go back to maybe the early 90s, after the Cold War, when the Clinton administration was pushing the democracy promotion idea, or even going back to the era of Jimmy Carter, who used morality and rights as a key element of US foreign policy. So it's been a while since we've heard this type of rhetoric. And I think this is Biden trying to contrast himself with Trump and responding to this idea and perception, which is accurate, that democracy and rights are under assault in a world that is increasingly susceptible to authoritarian tendencies couched in nationalism, which is true. So what does this mean? Yes, I do think that we will see from this administration, this incoming administration, more of a focus on rights issues. And I know in Pakistan there's a lot of interest as to whether this means that Biden will push India on the Kashmir issue, or rights more broadly. I think he may be willing to do that, though I think that considerations of interest and strategic partnership may hold him back. And this, I think, raises an important point, that he takes a risk by elevating the issue of democracy promotion and rights to such a key priority for his foreign policy, because invariably what he's going to do which is what US policy tends to do, and that is to be selective in terms of which countries it focuses on these rights issues and democracy issues, right? I mean, what we've seen with the Trump administration is a very strong willingness to call out China for its horrific treatment of the Uyghur population. China, of course, is a rival of the US, but you did not hear the Trump administration calling out the Israelis for how it treats Palestinians, or Indians how it treats the Kashmiris. So with Afghanistan, certainly I think that there will be concern and understanding within this incoming administration that by withdrawing from the country, that gives the Taliban a better opportunity to increase offenses and perhaps even be in a position to take power, which has huge, huge implications for rights and could squander the notable gains that have arisen in Afghanistan over the last few decades. And that includes advances in women's rights. But as I said before, Biden's main interest, and I think on a bipartisan level, a key US interest in Afghanistan is counterterrorism issues, not as much the issue of what the Taliban is able to do. So I think that if the Biden administration makes up its mind that it's going to whittle down its true presence to a very small number and try to focus only on the counterterrorism issue, focusing on the Islamic State issue, what's left of Al-Qaeda, that means that at the end of the day, it's not going to change its policy in a dramatic way to do everything possible to safeguard or secure human rights in Afghanistan. And it's sad, you could argue that it's hypocritical, but this is what it comes down to. And again, the fact that if he elevates human rights to such a high level in his foreign policy agenda, that agenda risks getting undercut if you see clearly this effort to be selective in terms of which countries you focus on rights and which countries you do not.
So Hitchens, now something that the United Kingdom has focused on is freedom of expression. I know that you have been working with Canada on freedom of expression across the world. You even have a special envoy looking into that. Do you think that in the new president-elect Biden, you will find a partner in talking about the values that he has been talking about during his election campaign? And would that be different for, let's say, countries like ours, like Pakistan, India, for example, Bangladesh, who by and large are experiencing curbing of freedom of expression? Do you feel it will be easier to work around those with the United States now?
I mean, everything one reads about Joe Biden oozes moderation and pragmatism. So he doesn't strike any of us as a person who will take a radical view. I mean, I think he was clearly very happy to challenge orthodoxy, and when the big debates were happening about the surge into Afghanistan, he was very happy to be the one arguing against the proposition. But his instincts seem to me always to have been those of moderation, responsibility, and therefore, though he talks about democracy, though he talks about holding a new D10 summit for those countries which are the major democracies of the world, I think that's probably to demarcate himself very clearly from his predecessor, who looked much more comfortable in the company of called dictators rather than traditional allies. But doesn't seem to me as though he's going to introduce a significant new agenda that he will spend a great deal of energy on freedom of expression or democracy. I think it's more that those words which used to be easy currency in diplomatic relations and foreign relations will become again easy currency in our conversations and in the speeches. I suspect when he's looking at the situation in Pakistan or the situation in Afghanistan, it will be a very pragmatic view of US interests, which will be the defining feature of his administration. And I feel extremely comfortable with that. I think it's great to have a pragmatic president at the helm in the United States.
Well, I mean, I do believe that there is a difference when there's, person-to-person contact is very different and people-to-people contact is extremely different. What I do believe is that there is a difference when leaders meet one another, with what their chemistry is like. How do you think Boris Johnson's chemistry would be like with Joe Biden as opposed to Trump and Boris Johnson, who were considered to be somehow of the same ilk?
I mean, Boris Johnson, I'm not here to advocate for Boris Johnson. He's got many critics in the UK, but he is a very affable person who it's very easy to get on with. And by all accounts, Joe Biden is also a very affable person who it's easy to get on with. So I have no doubt at all that they will end up in the same way that Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden will be having a very good personal relationship.
All right.
Is only
Okay.
one step of the story, because then you use those relationships to tackle differences between you,
Okay.
and it's a function rather than the real object of the relationship.
Well, I do have a question for you from the audiences, but before I come back to you, Kasuri Saab, how do you think Joe Biden would get along with our Prime Minister Imran Khan? Imran Khan had a very good chemistry with Donald Trump, and he said Donald Trump is a little bit like me. He's a little unorthodox, and so am I. So here he is with Joe Biden. Would Imran Khan be successful in charming him as well?
Well, I always believed that when in interstate relations, national interest is priority. So Pakistan realizes America's importance, and United States realizes Pakistan's importance in the region. And I've already referred to that, I don't have to repeat, particularly the rest of Afghanistan. I don't see much of a problem there, and particularly because despite what you said about Prime Minister Imran Khan and President Trump, similarity, or that he referred to some similarities, Prime Minister Imran had the advantage of having known the West very well. And so I suppose it makes it easier for him to get along with whoever is in power in either Britain or the United States. I don't really see many difficulties on that score.
Well, I'll ask you the same question, Michael, because a lot of people say, foreign policy is also about how leaders get along. It's about personal chemistry. It's about your worldviews. And, a lot of young people now believe that with the President Trump losing the election, it could be the beginning of, let's say, the right wing losing its space again, and maybe room for the left wing coming up. So do you feel that there will be a difference between the relationship of, let's say, Boris Johnson and Biden and Imran Khan, Modi, Putin, all these people who are basically right-wing?
Well, I would agree with Minister Kasuri's assessment that interests count a lot more than personal chemistry. And indeed, we do live in an era when the issue of personal symmetry and having senior leaders meet and having these very personal encounters. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of this in the context of Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. And of course, Trump and Modi, for example, and much more. But I don't think we should overstate the impact that type of dynamic has on bilateral relationships more broadly. Indeed, it's true that Imran Khan and Trump did appear to hit it off. But at the end of the day, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is going to be guided by considerations of interest more so than the personalities of the leaders. And I think when you look at the specific issue of U.S.-Pakistan relations, from a U.S. perspective or from a Biden administration perspective, Afghanistan is going to be the initial priority. I completely agree with what Minister Kasuri said, that the U.S. tends to look at Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan in the immediate term, so long as the U.S. is involved in the peace process there, so long as it continues to have a presence, even if a modest one, on the ground militarily, it's going to frame its relationship with Pakistan through engaging with Pakistan to ensure that Islamabad continues to work with the U.S. to push along the peace process. And issues like, counterterrorism, that's always been a big priority for the United States. And I think that this relationship is reaching an inflection point. And again, this has more to do with interests and geopolitical considerations than personalities. I say that because beyond the immediate term, we are going to look at the reality of a post-America Afghanistan. And so given that this relationship, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship for so long has been framed through the lens of Afghanistan, the relationship will need a new basis. It'll need a new anchor. And what that anchor, what that new basis will be is unclear. Now, I do see Biden as someone more willing than Trump to perhaps reconsider this issue of strategic dialogue and try to refocus cooperation in areas beyond security. Climate change, for example, is, I think, a key unexplored space for cooperation between the U.S. and Pakistan. But again, even if these two guys don't have great personal chemistry, or if they do have great personal chemistry, the trajectory of the relationship will be determined by other things, by geopolitical considerations, such as the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right. Well, I have a question for you, Sir Hitchens, coming from the audience. And the question is, will Brexit leave the United Kingdom at the mercy of the US without the collective protection of the European Union? It's a broad question, but important, very important.
I'm certainly not an advocate of Brexit, but I think the UK. We'd argue that the UK is leaving a trading and a political relationship, but it's still part of NATO. It's still going to have a trade deal with the rest of the European Union. So there's going to be some bumpy times immediately after the departure. But I think the UK is not going to simply go into the arms of the United States. The British people are not in favour of that. And in fact, the sense of being European is probably stronger than it was 5 years ago or 6 years ago in the UK, I would say. So I think it'll be bumpy, but I don't think it means the UK will simply go into the arms of the US.
All right. Kasuri Saab, would you like to comment on that? Would you like to comment on what you said?
And again, you have to guess. You can see I'm trying to press my ear. So there's something about, I assume that you're asking me about Brexit and also about the impact on a new trade deal with the United States. Now, if I'm right, my answer is there's not going to be easy. Particularly, there's talk a lot about President-elect Biden's Irish origins. Now, if Irish origins are important, and I'm sure there's a very strong Irish lobby in the US Congress, so the Good Friday Agreement will have to be there too, as much as possible. And there, of course, it's in US and UK interest to have a good trade agreement, but it is probably easier under Trump than it would be with Biden.
All right. Well, I have a question for you, Michael, from the audiences, and it's related to the Paris Agreement somewhat, which is that China's bold commitment to reach zero net carbon emissions by 2060, while the US lags behind. Any comments?
Well, I should say that I don't follow this particular issue very closely, so I'll be very brief. Indeed, I think that many of us, when we think about China and its energy policies, we tend to think of all its coal and these energy policies that are harmful to the environment. But it is true that China has made significant efforts. It has invested very heavily in clean energy in recent years. I think it is genuinely committed to bringing pollution levels down. But I think that all of these commitments that are made in these Paris agreements and these climate negotiations, they're all very ambitious. They're all, whichever country, particularly the major polluting countries, when they put these projections and commitments out there, they're all very ambitious. So it may be hard, not just for China, but other countries that pledge to do these things to actually succeed. But I don't know if it's in a position to reach that target, but I do think it is genuinely invested. And looking at the Pakistan context where you are, I know that when we talk about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, when we think about the energy projects associated with that project, I think about the Thar coal project. We think about other energy initiatives that are not necessarily good for the climate, but quietly, there have been some efforts to push wind, solar, those types of things as well. So China is doing that, but it's got a long way to go for sure.
All right. Well, Sir Hitchens, the same question really to you. What do you think? Would China's commitment to reach its zero net carbon emissions by 2060, and will the US just lag behind completely on this one?
Again, like Michael, I'm not an expert in this area, but what is clear is that China, which 10 years ago when we were working with them, was definitely cautious and a drag on international consensus in this area, has become something of a world leader. And because China's political system allows it to look not just 4 years or 8 years ahead, but 20 and 30 and 40 years ahead, it has a political system in place that can plan for the long term, and climate mitigation is a long-term issue. So that's why I'm relatively optimistic. I mean, it's clear that as Michael said, coal is still the dominant factor in China, and new coal power stations are still being built. So China's emissions will continue to be rising for another 10 years. But because they are a long-term leadership, a long-term administration, they will be putting in place arrangements from 2030 will start coming down. And I think there's a lot of scope for the US under the new president and the Chinese leadership to plot the next 10 or 20 years together. I think that's the kind of joint leadership which would be in the interests of other countries around the world, be it Europeans, be it in South Asia. So I think there's a lot of potential there for collaboration on probably the most critical issue facing us. And one of the things sitting in Europe at the moment where, like in the US, coronavirus is the dominant factor of daily life. Maybe the most acute factor of daily life, but the most chronic one is climate change. And as we come out of the pandemic, it becomes all the more obvious that the climate change challenge remains exactly as it was, with the same challenges and the same opportunities.
Well, Kasuri Saab, you wrote a book, Neither a Hawk Nor a Dove. And one was hoping that perhaps with the onset of, pandemics and locusts that Pakistan and India are experiencing, that there may have been some wisdom and they could have come together and there could be some kind of a talk between the two countries. Now, do you believe that with President-elect Biden in America at the helm of affairs, perhaps there could be some kind of an opportunity of talks between India and Pakistan with the current Modi government in place?
Yes, I tried very hard for that, and I think given all the details, and it's not been contradicted by any Indian or Pakistani, was in the loop, so very near an agreement on Kashmir. But before I respond to that, this thing on climate change is very important for developing countries, particularly like Pakistan. I just want to say one or two things. First of all, I hope and pray that President Biden will come back to Paris Agreement. An important part of that is carbon credits. And carbon credits was particularly for developing countries. And furthermore, China, yes, it is true, is to help Pakistan build charcoal, electricity through charcoal, but at the same time is playing a very major role in solar energy. And amount of solar panels that are now being put up even in residences in Pakistan bears testimony to that, because the costs have come down phenomenally. Now, coming to your India-Pakistan question, yes, I would hope so, but you see, frankly, anybody who is fair-minded cannot blame Pakistan. Whoever was in power in Pakistan, with Prime Minister Modi having a vested interest in fanning anti-Muslim and anti-Pakistan rhetoric to win elections in India, as you recently saw over in Bihar, not just in national elections, provincial elections. However I may want, how much I may want, we'll have to wait until either Prime Minister Modi leaves office or he changes his mind. Now, what role will President-elect Biden play? I think whatever the role may be, it used to, for example, during my tenure, it succeeded largely because it was announced. It wasn't trumpeted. For example, I remember before Mr. Vajpayee extended his famous hand of friendship to Pakistan, I received a call from Secretary of State Colin Powell. And he said to me, Khurshid, be ready to have some good news. And of course, we were ready. The moment Prime Minister Modi spoke of that, we invited him to Pakistan. Now, that sort of role, I think, remaining behind curtains, as it were, I would hope that President-elect Biden would be in a position to play, and more so, even if he did not make a big issue about human rights, he will still have to talk of human rights violations in Kashmir for him to have the credentials to play that role. So I'm sure he is enough politician to be able to do that. And I hope he'll do that.
Yeah, well, that was one of the questions that was being put to you, which was that can we expect Biden administration to take more aggressive?
I think it will be in Biden administration's own interest to play that role. Because there is reference to human rights and President Biden. Number two, in this area, it will be very difficult for any peace as you've known, been so many war and near war situations in Pakistan, India, at least 10 I've counted in my book, and on 5 occasions we really went to war. The last one was, of course, Kargil. Now, there is going to be no peace, regardless of what Modi does. He can do whatever he likes, and he's already failed in his attempt to cowed the Kashmiris. So I think President Biden, as a friend of India, will probably advise him privately, if not publicly, that there should be a renewed dialogue. And Prime Minister Modi may see the advantages of that if it is maneuvered somehow and they're leaked to the Indian media, even if they don't say it publicly, oh, the United States played a role. But what I feel is that, yes, I would want President Biden to play that role.
All right. Well, there is another question for you, Michael. It's a bit speculative, especially now, but I'll still read it out because we get to ask you a lot of questions, but the audience don't. So I'm going to read it out. Will we see the return of Trump in 2024?
Nothing wrong with speculative questions. No, obviously I don't know. Though certainly he appears to be quite committed to running again, and he could well try to do that. But what one just doesn't know with him. I think an interesting question perhaps is what to make of Biden, who will enter office, I think, as the oldest president in U.S. history, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know about his health, but given his age, one wonders if he may decide to be a one-term president. And if he does, that would mean that his vice president, Kamala Harris, becomes a particularly significant figure. And I think she's someone that is very well regarded within the Democratic Party, for sure. And so, the idea of a Harris versus Trump campaign, who knows? But ultimately, what I've heard is that the president is looking to launch some type of new TV enterprise that could take up a lot of his time, and who knows if that will be considered by him in a few years to be more important than getting back into politics. But one never knows with President Trump.
But we're all looking at Kamala Harris with a lot of interest here from South Asia, I can tell you that. Well, Sir Hitchens, another question for you is that in what way will the Biden win affect policy in the United Kingdom directly?
Well, I think it has had a direct impact upon the current negotiations on a UK-EU trade deal, because had Trump won, there were forces saying we didn't need to strike that deal, we could rely upon the US. And since Joe Biden has won, there has been renewed effort to finalize that deal, and I hope it will be concluded in the next couple of days or so. But I think the other main impact is that countries the size of the United Kingdom, the size of Pakistan, the size of France and Germany and Japan absolutely rely upon an international system that operates under the rule of law. And our greatest fear over the last 4 years has been that the force of that international system has been declining. And therefore, for us, the major impact of a new Biden administration, we hope, is that those international institutions and those international rules will gain renewed force. The US will be guarantors of them, and that means that we as middle-sized nations will be able to operate in a world that is ordered and is based on rules rather than on power. So it's not a particularly UK or European point. I think it's true of any of those nations which absolutely rely upon the rules-based system in order to thrive.
All right. Well, that's a good answer. Kasuri Saab, one of the questions that was also asked earlier is that there is a perception here in Pakistan that when President Trump becomes confrontational with Iran, it has a direct impact on sectarian violence in Pakistan. Now, whether that's true or not, but that is the perception here in Pakistan. Do you think with Joe Biden back or with the Democrats back at the helm of affairs that perhaps things will ease out and they're bound to ease out with Iran, and therefore there would be less of a sectarian violence in Pakistan? That's the question.
Well, I actually agree with this question because I remember when I was in office, I was advising Secretary of State Rice precisely this privately when they were saying there were no all options were on the table with reference to Iran, and I was saying it would have consequences for Pakistan. I was referring to precisely what the questioner has in mind, the sectarian dimension. And I hope President Biden will, if he doesn't rush into, he in fact said that he will go into the deal because that's what President Obama had signed and agreed to. And I think it was very rash of President Trump start to withdraw out of it, more out of spite probably for President Obama than for Iran, or maybe an equal spite for both. But I hope that he will in due course, if not immediately, because he has a lot of internal problems, back to JCPOA. JCPOA is the agreement under which this was finalized. Now, one of the disadvantages for the United States is that Iran is actually, now that America is out of it, they are no longer, and they say openly, they are no longer bound by the conditions of the nuclear deal, and they have raised and they have enriched to a higher level. So it is also President-elect Biden's interest to go back to the JCPOA, the deal with Iran, sooner rather than later.
I think you're on mute. Can't hear you.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
All right.
That's better.
There we go.
One question for Michael from the audience, and again, quite speculative, but I think I know the answer, what you will say at least. Is it a good idea for the US administration to intervene in apparently bilateral matters in the Middle East and South Asia?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, especially in just a minute or so. I mean, this is, I think, always been a question that's germane in these contexts. Obviously, it depends on who you ask, right? Certainly, I imagine many in Pakistan would love for the U.S. to intervene in the Kashmir dispute. India would not want that. Maybe that was the insinuation of that question. I think in an ideal world, the U.S. would frame its decision as to how to intervene in disputes from the context of humanitarianism, humanitarian challenges, because those are less political. But there's so many humanitarian crises in the world that invariably there's only so much that the world's only superpower can do, even if it tried to do more. And invariably it would be accused of the same type of selectivity that I had alluded to before, that it tries to help and engage those countries where it feels it has strong interests. I do think that the Biden administration will be focused not on the issue of bilateral interventions, that type of thing. It'll be focused on the multilateral. Because let's be very clear here. I think that we know that the world order now is experiencing some of the most volatility and uncertainty that it has for quite some time. And one major reason for that is that multilateralism is seemingly on the defensive and in many cases undermined by this toxic form of nationalism that militates against global cooperation. And yet, even though you have multilateralism on the defensive, the world has never been more vulnerable to these cross-border shared threats that require robust multilateralism in order to be properly addressed. And here I'm talking about climate change, cybersecurity issues, pandemics. So I think that if there's a contribution that a Biden administration could make in that regard, I certainly think that would be a good thing. But simple answer to your question is I never think it's a good idea for any U.S. government to be intervening in disputes that are invariably much too complex and sensitive to be getting involved in. But again, it all comes down to interests.
But Sir Hitchens, I'll come to you and really concluding remarks. You've been an ambassador, and you've been there in international diplomacy, etc. Do you think that the world is now moving towards more multilateralism than bilateralism, and that is how President-elect Biden is going to see it, like you said?
I think it probably does depend on which part of the world you're looking at. If you're looking at East Asia, it feels quite bilateral at the moment. If you're sitting in Europe, it feels very multilateral. And I think the jury is out in the Americas. I think that my one concluding thought is, certainly if you're sitting in North America or in Europe at the moment, what you want to happen immediately is getting through the pandemic. That would be the biggest boost that all of us could have. And the other thought is that, my main hope for the new Biden administration is that the new president is less interesting than the current president. I think a little bit of boredom would be quite good.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us on this special program. And I would also like to thank Beacon House School System for holding this very important session. And thank you for the audiences for all their questions. I would also like to thank UEL, which has been our sponsor. And I would like to remind that everybody that there are other sessions over the next 2 days. And for further details, you can visit SOT-events.com. So again, thank you, Sir Hitchens, Mr. Kasuri, Michael Kugelman, for taking out the time and for joining us. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.